is economic mobility. Economic mobility from the ground up, new models for economic power. My name is Sofia Leva. I'm from Claymore Space, the event company, and I'm the room host for the morning. We'll be starting in about 60 seconds. So just get settled and we'll hear from you soon. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to get started again. This is economic mobility from the ground up, new models for economic power. Today, our speakers are Adair Mosley, Dr. Brittany Lewis, Molly Birnbaum, and Theresa Thompson Nix. I'm really excited for them to talk today. Feel free to use the chat functions and the Q&A to ask questions that we'll be getting to throughout, and then we'll have a Q&A portion at the end. So I'm going to let our speakers take it away.
All right, I will start. We're going to first kind of briefly introduce ourselves and our work. My name is Dr. Brittany Lewis. I am CEO and founder of Research in Action. I also own a small development company called Urban Excellence. So Research in Action is an urban research, community engagement, and racial equity consulting firm. Our work really centers around moving kind of from equity-based language to equity-based actions using evaluation, helping city government and foundations develop intentional community engagement strategies with equity at the center. We also do racial equity assessments of both policy and practice in and outside of government and foundation structures. Urban Excellence is a small development company that I started a couple years ago as I was thinking about alternative wealth building strategies, particularly for Black homeowners and throughout the Twin Cities. You know, my work ranges broadly. I do a lot of speaking, featured in some local films like Jim Crow of the North. I also work and support research at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the Humphrey Institute. I'm a former Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank scholar. So my background is in research and housing and economic development, and my scope has kind of expanded to the criminal justice space. So I'm honored to be here with you all and talk about economic power, particularly Black economic power. I'm particularly interested in talking about investment in kind of Black developers, Black developments within communities that historically have been underinvested in, disinvested in, and have, you know, a lot of Black developers seeking to help recreate space and produce alternative wealth building models for communities to participate in. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about my work, those projects in that space, but then to think about entrepreneurship, you know, as a way to reach economic success.
I guess I'll go next. Good morning, everyone. Adair Mosley, and I have the privilege and honor of serving as the president and CEO of Pillsbury United Communities, a 140-year-old community impact organization here in the Twin Cities, anchoring its work in humility and asking a very simple and basic question of community: what do you need? And from there, able to really unearth and bring their aspirations to fruition. Our work manifests in three areas: people, place, and prosperity. People achieving greater health and well-being. It's about place, and it intersects using arts and culture and civic engagement as tools for social justice and change. And then prosperity, equitable education and meaningful employment and economic mobility efforts. And all of that is undergirded by a vision that every person has personal, social, and economic power. And the work that we're doing every day is on behalf of those that live and labor in community to be able to ensure that they all have access to those three things. And it manifests itself into a wide range of activities and programs. And then we really unlock the entrepreneurial spirit of the organization and run 6 social enterprises, anything from a community newspaper all the way up to a full service grocery store in North Minneapolis. So a wide range and spectrum of work. Most recently, and what I'll spend most of this conversation on today, following the murder of George Floyd, and seeing what we saw as the unrest, but I think also showed us the fragileness kind of our communities. We've categorically known the lack of investment that has happened in Black and Brown communities, particularly in Black. And we stood up a community development corporation, Justice Built Communities, which certainly intersects a lot with what Dr. Lewis has described in her work, and is meant to be an institution, a quarterback of bringing like-minded institutions and individuals together to be able to collectively galvanize around a vision of place-based economic development in revitalizing our commercial corridors. So I'll spend some time this morning talking about the depth of that work. But I will turn it over to my colleague, Theresa.
I might be muted. There we go. Good morning, everyone. See, I don't have a cup of coffee like Adair, so that could be why. But good morning. I'm Theresa Thompson Nix, and I'm excited to be here with you today. I work at Move Minnesota, and I work as the community engagement manager. You know, I manage programs at the organization, and I'm excited to work in this area because it works parallel with what I'm about. Transportation is about getting people to where they need to go, and that's essential in the recovery of our economy. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. But at Move Minnesota, we're building a movement to demand transportation that protects the climate, our families, and our futures. So, you know, transportation impacts us every day. Minnesota is not only regional, but a statewide area where we have inequalities. And these mirror the inequalities around our nation. So we look at using transit, biking, and walking as some of the most powerful tools we have to make our communities accessible. So that's what I want to talk with you about today. It's going to be very important to talk about why transit is important. It's intersectional. And I want to talk about some models about, you know, what we're seeing in the streets right now. So that's what I want to share with you. And yeah, I'll kick it over to our last presenter, Molly.
Hey everyone, thanks Theresa. Hi everyone, my name is Molly. I work for Accenture. Accenture is a consulting firm. We focus mainly on digital strategy and technology strategy for various different Fortune 500 companies. But within Accenture, I work on our corporate citizenship team, which is our sort of CSR team. And within that, there's two sort of hats that I wear. One is just our general corporate citizenship. And then the other is the lead of our Inclusive Future of Work project. So for general corporate citizenship, you know, our vision in particular in Minneapolis, right, is to create a more inclusive Minneapolis and St. Paul region that offers more employment opportunities to more underrepresented people for long-term economic growth and stability of the region. So we focus on skilling and pathways and job employment opportunities and environmental stewardship, as well as supporting entrepreneurs. And I'll talk a little bit more later about different ways that we've done that, particularly in the Minneapolis community. And then also with our Inclusive Future Work project, that's where we really look at the ways in which the economy is changing, technology is changing jobs every day, and getting people ready to participate in that digital economy, making sure that people have the right skills and sort of thinking about skilling as a way to promote economic empowerment. So I'm really excited today to talk a little bit about that. Really excited to talk about economic empowerment for communities. Just want to say, as an ally, really excited to be on this panel with really incredible people, and can also sort of speak about, as an ally, supporting Black communities as well. So really excited to get started.
So I think I'll kind of kick us off a little bit, and I want to kind of ground us. I'm thinking about Black economic power. I think we have to first kind of acknowledge kind of histories of strategic disinvestment and the manufacturing of the communities under which we're talking about. And I use the word manufacturing, meaning that there were strategic policies and practices used to create the context under which much of us are doing our work. You know, a realization that I've come to or have spoken out loud but knew was the case, that white supremacy made my job possible. The practices and policies of white supremacy made what I do possible, whether it's connected to the research projects that I do that aims to, we do a lot of housing studies where we're looking to mitigate the negative impacts of gentrification, or we do studies in the spaces of evictions where we're aiming to help support communities that are constantly displaced and disenfranchised by not just the courts, but landlords. And I would argue that to even get to this place where we can talk about Black economic empowerment, we have to acknowledge the many barriers that the folks that we claim we are serving are facing every day. And seeking to get to that kind of space of entrepreneurship or economic stability is a battle. You know, something that pops in my mind is, you know, when I did the eviction study, I would do interviews with folks that have been evicted. And I actually ended up having to do some interviews in folks' cars because they were choosing not to go to shelter as an act of resistance because shelters were requiring them to pay to stay. And it was a policy that I was not deeply aware of at the time. But if you think about this notion of stability and even getting to economic empowerment and all the barriers that folks are encountering and what quote unquote choices that are being made available to them as they seek that kind of economic empowerment, note that we have a lot of work to do, both across human services and our criminal justice systems, housing inequities, we're in an affordable housing crisis. So I just want to acknowledge that reality, that for some folks, it is a privilege to have the conversation about Black economic empowerment or entrepreneurship in general. It is a dream or aspiration for many, and I don't think it should be. I think we all, it is in our respective spaces of influence that we should try to break those barriers. But I'd also want to note that Black women in particular, whom I argue are economically typically suffering the most, are our fastest and highest growing entrepreneurs in the country across all peer groups, male or female. And that tells you something about who they are. It tells you something deeply about who Black women are when you can see their representation in the rates of unemployment, rates of, you know, how they're paid unequitably, head of households, managing lots of dependents, but still growing more businesses than anyone, white or Black, or Asian, Hispanic, Native, etc. But I also think that tells you that they aren't able to fare well in a traditional market, and they're being intentional about finding alternative strategies to sustain themselves. But what the data also says is that they're not retaining or expanding any of those businesses. That also means they're not getting access to the loans they need. They're not procuring the contracts they need through city government, local or otherwise. And now we're talking about systems that continue to reproduce inaccessibility. So I just wanted to kind of lay that grounding because we're having a conversation about, I guess, Black economic empowerment or economic empowerment in general, but there's a context under which the folks that we are serving are interfacing with a lot of systems, barriers, racism, race, sexism, ableism, all the things you can imagine that prevent them from realizing those dreams or goals. You know, for myself, who is a small developer of color, what I'd argue with relative privilege, this has been hard for me to do. So when I started Urban Excellence, and what it comes down to in the development community, either you own the land or you have $500,000 plus sitting in your bank, so you can either fund the project yourself or you find investors to fund that project. I also believe that, you know, development is a white boy's game. And let's just be quite direct and honest about that. I'd argue that, you know, at the state, for instance, there's supposed to be oversight for, you know, diverse businesses, and there's like these minority requirements, et cetera. And we all know how those things are being subverted, right? So we think about representations of women on job sites, how that might disproportionately impact and support more white women being hired to support those contracts versus women of color or people of color in general. There's this notion that we are not as prepared, that we don't have the same networks, and that is very much true. The networks are very different. You know, I think for someone who is as connected as I am, both to the city, to developers and community, I found a lot of roadblocks trying to get the development company off the ground. Jumped through a lot of city and county red tape as it relates to actually acquiring the land, where they're promoting all the time this access to vacant land, dilapidated properties. We really want folks to come in and help kind of rebuild our city and all those things. They make it extremely challenging to secure access to those things. So in the end, I ended up choosing to develop first on the land I owned because you had to prove something out. Because also you walk in without a host of, you know, development projects on your belt to prove what you can do. So I realized really quickly, because when the RFP comes out and the 4 or 5 major development companies who have like the major, you know, architectural team, they have the engineering team, right? Okay, so here's the deal. I subcontract what I do, right? I build teams and we're like, you know, 1 or 2 man show. I have my electrician, I have my plumber. I don't have this infrastructure that a larger development company will have. So once the RFP comes out, you know, I've been told many times from the city, we already know that because of your lack of current projects to show us, you're always going to be in the back burner as we think about who to choose. But if you want to support developers of color, many of whom don't have those same networks or that same infrastructural capacity, you got to rethink your criteria and your approach. And developers of color might need different kind of technical assistance to even produce the products that these large development companies can do. You know, I share that because I also had to infuse a lot of my own money into this. And there's like relative privilege in that to even get to that place. You know, I'll stop there because I want my other colleagues to chime in. But I think when we're thinking about, you know, economic empowerment, we have to think about the context under which we are trying to support communities to get there and the barriers that they're encountering from the city, county, state, unscrupulous landlords, you know, et cetera, to realize those dreams. Employment discrimination, I would argue that's a big reason why Black women in particular are growing businesses and finding ways to support themselves economically, but then they're not retaining or expanding because they're not getting the technical assistance that they need. And then I acknowledge myself as someone that has a different kind of privilege that moves in that space and still struggles to get the resources that I might need to be successful. I just want to raise those points up.
Extremely powerful points, Dr. Lewis. And as you were talking, one of the things that I was thinking about is this notion, and it's even in our title, of resiliency. And we oftentimes romanticize resiliency. And rather than thinking about the infrastructure systems and policies that need to surround individuals, that need to surround communities, that foster resiliency. And what you oftentimes see in underinvested communities and those that have been categorically kind of marginalized is that those infrastructures and supports and access don't exist. And it's inevitable that, even we will see perhaps unrest in the future, that communities have not been strengthened with the infrastructure and the supports that they need in order to rebuild, to come back better. One of the innovative tools that it's not, certainly not innovative, it's been around for quite some time, and we've seen across our country institutions and communities be able to revitalize themselves by using the power of community development corporations. And Justice Bill Community, which we stood up, is that community development corporation. And we saw a categorical kind of disinvestment in community development corporations, largely from philanthropy, which were funding them, and then stepped away from them. And I think you also saw some of the erosion in community and the infrastructures and vision that was coming to fruition kind of really, dissipate and go away. And so part of us developing the Community Development Corporation, again, following the murder of George Floyd, is what we saw is that along our commercial corridors that we didn't have the economic businesses, we didn't have Black and brown business kind of in entrepreneurship, we didn't have space. And as in further market analysis, as in what Dr. Lewis has described here, was access to capital, access to markets, individuals that know how to braid the financial stack together, right? Of both getting, whether it's tax increment financing for projects, all of these other tools that were available largely to their white counterparts, and to savvy organizations that knew how to, or that had teams and capacity to be able to bring those things together. So the impetus of this idea of the Community Development Corporation was to exactly do that. Serve both as this community quarterback. How do we bring and how do we support using our ability to be able to both get philanthropic dollars, but also private sector dollars in support of individuals like Dr. Lewis or Chris Webley or Houston White, other micro developers, Black developers in community that want to be able to develop space, and then activate a community's vision behind these developments. How do we do a community-centered design process that engages community, authentically engages them in what they want to see to their community? I would say that we're not short of ideas and individuals that have a level of creativity and innovation in community. What we lack is that access to the capital, access to the financing. And so our goal is really to usher that in, and have had some very early success in partners that want to come along in this work. Philanthropic institutions that want to be able to leverage their balance sheets in pursuit of this vision, and knowing that we can kind of catalytically bring these assets to community. And so we're really standing up this Community Development Corporation that I think will both serve as a catalyst to neighborhood revitalization. The other thing that we found that we're hoping to do more of with this is kind of a buy and hold strategy. Part of what we're seeing early on, and which will be the signs of gentrification and displacement, is those that have capital, have liquidity, are able to come into markets and buy and hold land, and with no vision of redevelopment. And as we were doing an analysis, even on West Broadway, prior to some of the unrest that followed George Floyd, we had business owners that had property there that had not made one single investment for the last 10 to 20 years, and who don't live in our community, who don't have the vested interest of our community. And so what we recognize that if we didn't buy and hold to be able to bridge ownership to Black developers, so that way, even if Dr. Lewis or some of the others are not as ready today, that we can hold this land because we want to preserve And we want to make sure that Black developers are prioritized in that. And so one of the strategies we're activating as part of the CDC is a buy and hold to opportunistically bridge this land to Black developers, Black entrepreneurs, so we don't run the risk of losing it. Theresa.
Creating that bridge is so important, Adair. You know, when you are talking about that, it's really resonating with me. You know, one of the things that I am really focused on these days is, you know, building economic power in the community on a micro level, because it's at the cellular level where everything really operates. Not only is it how we move and live and have our being, but it's also how we are communicating with each other and how we're getting around. And so I did mention that I work at Move Minnesota. That is what I do. And also I have to say, I have to bring my full self here. Can I do that? I'll bring my full self here and say that I'm also a soul medic. I'm an artist and a person who has taken several entrepreneurs under my wing to just make sure that they were feeling empowered with coaching and able to line up the micro pieces of their life to have a larger impact on the community with their business. And so that's what I'm about and what I do. And they are parallel with one another because it's about moving people forward. And so I want to talk a little bit about this piece that Dr. Lewis talked about with resiliency, through anchoring us, activating us, alleviating the barriers, and accelerating our momentum forward. So first I'll say, I don't know if any of you all have taken time to read Emergent Strategy, but I really encourage it. It's worth it. It helps give you a little bit of a different perspective. It's great to read with your team because I know we're talking with a lot of people who are out there and change makers. So I think that it's great. And so our world is changing. And in order to be successful, we must change our perspective on the world. And I argue that we have to look at what's happening on a micro level in order to influence what's happening at a macro level. So the models that we use that copy other models aren't always the best. They don't always fit. Yes, Adrienne Marie Brown, somebody just chimed in. Thank you so much, Leah. And so I want to say that what takes courage is to innovate and tailor solutions to the challenges that you're facing. So in anchoring my work, I focus on building that economic power by supporting families and people as microeconomies. The goals of an economy can be stability, freedom, security, equity, growth, and efficiency. All functions in a family, all functions in a person's everyday life that we're trying to fill. And so the goal of my work really is to reduce the cost burden for individuals and families getting around in sustaining the economy in that way. I want to give a quick statistic and say that AAA says an average of $9,000 per year is the cost for owning a car. And so when we remove that cost from families' budgets, they all of a sudden have the space to invest, to dream, to save. And so taking transit or an alternative form like biking or walking or rolling, even scooter, you know, create space for thousands of families to recover economically and start something new. And even to get from a place of no return, you know, the place where we have completely bottomed out up into something sustainable. So in terms of activation, we want to focus on the microeconomies doing work on a larger system because we want regional prosperity. Acceleration, we want people-centered design on transit that moves the economy forward. I'm thinking about the cultural values that we have, you know, cooperative economics, purpose, you know, creativity, some of these things. What if these were actually infused in our transit system where You know, about 40% of transit riders are people of color. And so it felt like a more equitable, you know, situation, you know, where people weren't nervous about getting on the train because of what experience that they would have, but that we lifted each other up. So transit is important for so many reasons. And I'll just quickly mention, it's got intersectional benefits, you know, climate, racial justice, education, jobs, collective prosperity, accessibility, housing, you know, the list goes on with all types of affordable access. And so the goal is to reduce the cost burden again for families. Housing and transportations are like the top cost burdens on some of the top cost burdens on families. And so you alleviate one of those and it creates a lot more breathing room. So this is what I want to share. You know, this is what I'm about, what I'm doing, and they all merge together when we talk about designing systems for people that work for people and removing the burden. I mean, you get hit with too many microaggressions, and as you know, it creates a heaviness in our soul that just doesn't want us to move forward at all. And so I'm holding space with the people who have made economic strides and stepped out there in faith, which is one of our people core values, and been dashed. And so I call on other people in this room to hold space and think about how we're making room for one another, because space is where things happen. And I hope we can have space to think about that on the train as you rethink your commute. You've got a lot of time to just think about how to, you know, fix the world's problems. So Molly, I'll kick it to you.
Yeah, Theresa, I just wanted to say, so you were talking a lot about removing those burdens, right? And those cost burdens. And just thinking, Dr. Lewis, what you were talking about just the access to capital and support and access, right? So before I worked at Accenture, I worked for close to a decade in education in New York. And I made that choice to go for profit, right? Mostly because I wanted to figure out ways to help sort of redistribute capital. Maybe Accenture doesn't want to hear me say this out loud, but I'm going to. And that's why I work on our corporate citizenship team. And so a couple of different ways that we're doing that I just want to sort of share, specifically thinking about the cost burdens, right? So Theresa, you were talking about that. And we did a big project in St. Louis where we were helping workers sort of transition and go into computer and software development in the St. Louis Promise Zone. And the biggest barrier that we kept on seeing was transportation, right? And it was like, there was no way to transport yourself to the training programs. And then it was a really big barrier. And so we were able to start a partnership with Lyft to help, they would give Lyft credit to people. And it was a very, it's just for that specific purpose, but through that, Lyft ended up expanding that partnership. And now Lyft has offered ride credit, and it's become, a thing that Lyft and Uber and all of these companies are doing. And again, this doesn't fully solve the problem of transportation for everyone in urban communities, but it is a way. And so I think finding those ways that we can loop in the private sector to help is what I particularly am interested in and what we like to do at Accenture. A couple other things that I just wanted to highlight, this question right about support and access. Dr. Lewis, you're talking about like responding to an RFP and not having, the projects from before that, right, to help you respond to that RFP. At Accenture, we have a diverse supplier development program, which we've had for several years, where the whole goal is to expand relationships with diverse businesses owned by minorities, women, people of color, LGBT people, veterans, and service disabled veterans as well. And so it's a 12 to 18 month program where we pair executive mentors from Accenture with diverse supplier founders and help them through that process of responding to RFPs and that sort of thing, and get them in front of the right people so that they can start sort of, becoming suppliers, like the suppliers that people go to. So we have a program like that, and we actually have a new program that we started, in response to the George Floyd protests, right, which is the Black Founders Development Program, which is specifically focused on Black founders. And it's launching this year, but essentially, we want to make sure that at Accenture, we have our own investment arm called Ventures, where we sort of function like a VC firm. And the goal is to really, through this Black Founders Development Program, is to provide more direct access to venture capital, to corporate mentorship, to different strategic connections with Accenture's other business partners and clients. So, really trying to, our goal, right, is to really figure out different ways that we can help support Black businesses, businesses owned by people of color, navigate that process. Dr. Lewis, that you were talking to, Adair, that you were talking to as well. So, yeah, just wanted to share those two things.
So, it's really great to hear about maybe some of the efforts or strategies that folks individually or organizations are offering folks, but then I'm processing a little bit through if we feel like, and this is more of a question to the group, do we feel like the folks that need our programs the most are getting access to them? And why or why not? And I'm assuming a lot of this is your own kind of qualitative analysis of, the vision of who is supposed to serve, who actually takes advantage of it, outreach challenges. I'm kind of curious to hear from you all in your experience, what barriers you think your clients are having in getting access to, or what they've shared with you. Because I'm kind of reflecting on the barriers I feel like I've encountered as, a business owner trying to seek those resources. Knowing that they're there, but then also, for instance, LISC did a study recently where they interviewed a number of developers of color to kind of assess the barriers. And I think something that they were kind of dreaming up was kind of what appears to be like a fellowship program, almost like a Bush fellowship for developers of color, where they would get an infusement of some dollars, they would get technical support and a team to then execute that kind of creative placemaking vision. I have no idea if that's come to fruition or that, again, is just an idea, and if they found a funder to actually fund it. But I think it's an amazing idea. And I gather there's a lot of barriers behind them actually getting off the ground, and then the politics of then who gets selected to be these fellows, and how do we make sure that we're not engaging with the same actors, because I think we all understand what that looks like. So I'm just curious to hear from you all what you think the barriers have been in people getting access to these opportunities to support their economic growth or entrepreneurship, and or what are the readiness issues that you're encountering when folks want to come to you and say, I have all these great ideas, but they might have some initial readiness challenges and even taking advantages of your resources?
Really, really, really great questions. And in my market analysis, what I've found is that the budding kind of entrepreneurs or developers that are coming up, categorically, I believe, say that they don't have access to the kind of financial capital that they need to be able to bring their ideas to fruition. And I think that's been some of the lending practices of institutions. What would be the dearth of resources that are available to particularly Black and Brown developers, entrepreneurs, small business. And I think that's why you've seen a shift more recently in financial institutions saying we want to pour more money into small business development for Black and Brown, because they've recognized that their practices have been inherently racist and and marginalized a large populace. And we see that if we disaggregate the data here in our region, we can see that. We see that even investors, even individuals that have wanted to go to these institutions have been turned away. And so I think there's something about that. The other thing I think, especially from our public sector, as part of our model, we've been doing some community engagement around what are the tools that you can put in your toolbox as it relates to development that many more mainstream developers don't have, right? Authenticity and connection to community, community benefits agreements. And so those things have not been of value in a traditional kind of RFP process. And I think you're seeing some shifts, we need to see more that puts value. And we would have a strong competitive edge because of our proximity to community, and authentically knowing what community wants and what's going to work specifically for our market. And those things are not the traditional financial levers or tools that we look at. That we're seeing that if we are to have equitable place-based development, those things have to rank as high as priority as some of the financial analysis and the pro forma. And so I think that's part of it has been the same individuals are producing the RFPs, producing the contracts, and not having any relationship with community around what it needs, which I think, to your point, is producing some of the same actors. And that network hasn't been expanded. And so I think that there's a lot of effort around democratizing these processes, reducing the barriers that don't, fictitious barriers that kind of exist that don't really need to be there. That are holding individuals back from being able to break through in the market. And we've seen this, I've been in several conversations with the individuals at Upper Harbor Terminal, for example, which I think is a great example of that. Now, of the magnitude and scale, right, you need probably a more skilled developer, but how does that opportunity also pave way for new entrepreneurs and small business and developers to be able to contribute to that work as well? And that's a question I think they're trying to unpack.
I just wanted to answer this question that came in the chat and then allow Molly and Theresa to chime in. They asked this question about what I meant by readiness. My colleague, Dr. Joy Lewis, she describes this, like, she calls it the Black tax. And I think it's really interesting. In short, she's saying that as a result of both the historic barriers, whether it's connected to barriers and in the kind of educational systems that we're often pushed through, barriers in the kind of access to certain resources that many of us are experiencing, there might be a lack of like full preparedness to go into networks of kind of relative privilege and affluence that already have acquired strong networks, strong technical supports, et cetera, that actually have invested in them and mentored them to be prepared to engage in certain settings, where not all folks are completely ready at that particular standard. That does not mean they don't have a technical skill, the aptitude, or the vision. It means that there are skills that still need to be acquired and supported. Let's be honest, no one got here without mentorship. No one got here without someone taking you under their wings, teaching you things, helping you acquire additional skills, et cetera. And often if you're outside of those networks and you don't have those folks pulling you up, i.e. putting you on, so to speak, you don't appear fully ready, right, to participate in certain programs, or you don't also understand like the kind of normalization of how folks want their applications to look. Or it's almost like going into a meeting and we got Robert's rules. Like, who does that in community, right? But there is like a politics to how you engage, right? That presumes that you're not ready. You understand, right, how to engage. You understand consensus, but there's a politics behind the rules of the game, so to speak, that I think developers of color aren't always, acculturated to. So presumably we're not ready, right? And I use the square codes because it's not that there's not the skills, the vision, or the aptitude, but there is a politics of how these grants or RFPs or working with the city work, and you need mentorship, right? You need someone to take you under your wings to support that. So when I talk about that, I say readiness with like, a grain of salt, because I think that gets used against folks of color who I think are innovative and have the skills. So that's what I meant.
You're also, I think what you're calling out too is the deep embedded kind of white supremacy in our systems. That says that, right, those that have prescribed it to be the right way or the order or what's of important and value are oftentimes individuals that, right, benefit from privilege and benefit from systems of white supremacy. And so that's ultimately the thing I think that we need to also unpack as part of, to make this more equitable, is dismantling those oppressive kind of systems.
I just want to respond, Dr. Lewis, to your question. I think in particular about knowing, the businesses, right? Knowing who the different companies are. And it's a question, it's a real question that I think we struggle with, right? I can speak on behalf of Accenture, I can speak on behalf, I can't speak on behalf of all private sector, but it's just true. You don't know what you don't know. And there's so much untapped talent in communities. And so, this is part of the reason we participate with the Center of Economic Inclusion. This is part of the reason we have relationships with NEDA that supports BIPOC entrepreneurs in Minneapolis, right? Like, this is why we have these kinds of connections, so that we can find the untapped talent that's out there. And so just an example of one way that we did this. So our African American Employee Resource Group hosted a call with the Black Chamber of Commerce and NEDA, because they were just trying to help people understand the local market challenges and opportunities of what was happening in Minneapolis to the business community in the wake of COVID. And following that, they sent out links to sites that listed local and national Black-owned businesses that people could support. And I'm talking about like Accenture employees. And then Accenture employees, they log their activities in SharePoint, like on our internal site, so that everyone at Accenture could learn about the different businesses that people were supporting. So there was restaurants, there was clothing stores, coffee shops, other types of businesses. And it was, again, sort of sharing that knowledge. We saw this happen in Minneapolis. We did it in other cities across the country. But again, it's sharing, just really knowledge sharing that I think can be really helpful. It seems pretty simple, but a lot of people just don't know what they don't know.
Yeah, this thing about people don't know what they don't know, it's illuminating the Johari window, right? Y'all can look that up if you want more information on it, Google that. But I want to talk a little bit about the difference between mentorship and sponsorship, because I think this might, put things in focus a little bit for what some of the barriers are and how we think about readiness. Mentorship is, kind of giving information. That this is at least my definition, is giving information and, answering questions. Sponsorship, in my mind, is really about, opening your Rolodex and helping to make things happen for people who are specifically on a path. And, a lot of times when we think about ourselves as mentors, it's about information, but what happens when we really, don't put our own ideas on other people, but allow people to utilize our microphone, utilize some of our connections. And what happens is really important, because business is network, net worth is network, etc. So I think those are really important. But what I want to talk about quickly is some of the barriers that people are facing in terms of getting around from place to place from job interview to appointment. As an entrepreneur, you often have to have an anchor, which is, you know, at least a part-time job to give you some cash flow, you know, and help you start activating, or some sort of, you know, money pool. And when you can't get around equitably, that's a problem. You know, so right now, Move Minnesota has been working on ways to decriminalize non-payment of fare. This is important because right now, if you don't pay your transit fare and you get a fine, it's $180 and a misdemeanor. So we're currently looking at how to get the laws changed so that that doesn't happen. BIPOC riders are 7 times more likely to be charged and arrested as compared to their white peers. So when we just talk about getting from place to place, from opportunity to opportunity, you know, that's also something that I'm thinking about in terms of barriers. And in terms of readiness, I remember having a person ready to come down to the Capitol to testify, and you know, they are unsheltered and couldn't even, you know, afford you know, the transit fare to get there to, you know, advocate for transit. So there's the issue. So you know, what can we do as business leaders and as people in the community? I wanted to pull up this idea of Blacktivation. It was really activation in the Black community. And let me just see if I have it here in my notes. But you know, it's this idea where we're getting back to helping people, sponsoring them, making sure they've got access to resources to improve their credit, resources to improve their knowledge base, maybe even certification in your sector. You know, that is really helpful. You know, anytime that they can get paid for their ideas, you know, that is very helpful for, you know, for their perspective. So these are all things to be thinking about. And then one other barrier I want to mention is the language which we're using. And I think we've all talked about this a little bit, the language which we're using to make our policies. The language, in even our job descriptions, language is very powerful. And so when we ease that language, when we demilitarize that language, it creates opportunities for even more people to be considered for the opportunities. So that's one of the ways that you can do sponsorship anywhere you are. That's one of the ways you can create space. So I just wanted to talk about those as barriers and readiness, and the difference between mentorship and sponsorship.
Thank you, Theresa. I just want to open the floor to participants. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or use the Q&A function, and we'll continue the conversation and lift up those questions as they come in. Thanks.
So I'm not sure, Sofia, if everyone heard you, because you kind of broke up a little bit on my end, but we wanted to ask the attendees if they had any questions for us. I'm sure you're really enjoying us talking at you a little bit, but we want to make sure that if you had any direct questions for us, that we could pay close and direct attention to those questions in our remaining time together. So it looks like there's a question here for Adair.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. One of the tools that we started to codify for quite some time is human-centered design, design thinking, that is largely being used for products on the private side. And we have adopted the process as part of our organization, and that it can also help us deliver on a community engagement process and how we reimagine both our programs and services and even space, right? The spatial imagination that our communities oftentimes come in contact with. And ultimately, it's about centering community at the center and making them appear in the decision-making process. Oftentimes we go to them as an extraction point rather than really lifting up and not only both compensating them for their time and meaningful compensation for their time because they're an expert and they're an expert on their community. And so this is really about this is about centering their voice, making them an equal in the process, and we then are able to ideate and generate prototypes as part of our process using their insights. The other thing that I think it does, it builds communities' agency, and it builds their capacity to be able to interact with systems as much as right around this kind of readiness. And when we describe it, that they're then prepared and that they have built their capacity that they can go out and do it and form their own community organizations, community groups, and now have this tool in their toolbox. And so it's an iterative process. One of the most critical pieces of it, though, is empathy. And empathy is about immersing ourselves in the lived experiences of others, really succumbing our own personal agendas and having proximity to those that do this walk daily. And I think without that, you don't get to answering the right question. And you don't get to ultimately solutions that are relevant to the communities in which you're serving. So happy to share more, but it's our own take on design thinking, human-centered design that we've adopted inside of the agency.
Okay, so I'm noticing that not every one of the attendees could actually see the question. So Adair just answered the question, can you talk more about the community design or vision process, ways to engage and include the community? And the next question that came up was just about the RFP process and rethinking the criteria, making it more inclusive for Black and BIPOC businesses. And the question is, what are some actions we can take to actually change the criteria in RFP process at the systems level? So I will try to answer first, and I'm sure there's others on the panel that might have ideas or thoughts. So myself, and Dr. Joy Lewis have the honor of leading a series of forums this year that came out of a desire for both funders and the Minnesota Department of Human Rights and others to develop some strategic policy actions post George Floyd's murder. And one of the components of that project is the funders table that's been created. And this table has been created and is currently being led by the POLAB Foundation. And the agreement really was that this was what we call a reverse RFP. Now, what does that mean? Typically RFPs, whether it comes out from a foundation or city government, means that there is a body separate from community that has defined an agenda, has articulated its agenda and its needs, and is asking community to apply and fit within that framework. And I would argue that should not be the approach. If you really want to equitably serve the people you claim, your process of agenda setting should come from them directly. Because I also feel like there's a catch-22 here where people are trying to fit into a box that others defined and not able to actually innovatively develop programming and supports that they know community need with the approach that they know is gonna work versus trying to fit into a normative framework that either can be, right, people have already validated or people already believe is a worthwhile pursuit because 10 other people have already done it. I don't believe in that at all. As far as research and action as an organization goes, we've never applied for one RFP, and I absolutely refuse to. That presumes that the community had no input in the framework of that work, but that someone's telling them what it should be. It is about relationships. It is about building collaborative partnerships and finding the resources to do the work on behalf of community. That's how research and action as an organization moves. How can you change that at the systems level? Well, who's defining these RFPs? It's like family boards, right? It's city government leaders, supervisors, et cetera. People that I feel like are somewhat fairly far removed from community themselves, who use like perhaps reports or data on a chart, or they're looking at their other colleagues, right? They're looking at the buzzwords or trends and trying to determine like where they want to have impact versus asking community where they need the impact. I've also heard folks that work within these organizations say that they're always told to talk from a deficit-based place and not an asset-based place. And that really boils me, right? When we only talk about these communities for their deficits for the purposes of securing funding, we are reproducing, the nonprofit industrial complex, are reproducing networks of poverty, the notion that the only way that we can thrive is to prove that we are constantly impoverished, versus let's highlight both our wins, our assets, let's also grow those and pull people up with us in the process. I think to rethink that process, our leaders need to reevaluate the ways in which white supremacy is being written into the RFP, literally. It's a paternalistic approach. That just paternalistic means that someone claims to know you better than you know yourself and tells you what you should be doing.
Such powerful, and as our organization institution that has had to respond to many thousands of RFPs constantly, and one of the things that we committed ourselves to is actually the reframing and the narrative of how we talk about our communities and the people, and that we would not talk about them from a deficit base, that it would be talking about individuals in communities thriving despite the overt and kind of covert institutional and structural racism that exists in their lives, and the disinvestment, that people are making a way out of no way. And let's tell that story of triumph. But as it relates to more, and this is through the lens of economic development, so I'll talk about that, things of reworking RFP processes. I think a lot of it has to do about the intersectionality and the harms that have been caused to Black and Brown communities. So talking about an environmental justice component, and how do developments promote environmental justice, talking about the economic justice to a community. Processes, RFPs have to center, how are you not going to think about displace and gentrify communities and push people out. And if we don't bake those strategies in on the front end, then by the time we get through with the development and we think about it, it will be too late. And so I think, especially in our public sector, which is oftentimes releasing RFPs as it relates to economic development, need to be thinking about these things, thinking about land use. How do you take distressed and inactive lots and to combat blight? Thinking about the public benefit, largely thinking about both innovation and design, thinking about the economic drivers, and how when we built North Market, even though it wasn't stated, we committed to, as part of our application to Hennepin County for that property, that, over 75% of the employees that worked at that store would be North Minneapolis residents. That we would go above and beyond in our subcontractors, beyond what the state and the Civil Rights Department was requiring in terms of minority and women-owned contractors, that we would raise that. And so I think we can raise those measures as part of our RFP processes as well, and also demand that institutions and companies that want to do work in our communities really prove that those that are in community are the direct beneficiaries of this work.
Thank you. I see another question coming in. If panelists can share their or your priorities when it comes to other systemic investments.
We'll let Theresa or Molly go first here.
Hey, thanks. Yes, thank you for the question. Can panelists share their priorities regarding other systemic investments? I really am thinking about investing in the soul. This might be a different type of, economic discussion, but I'm thinking about, again, my context as people being microeconomies. And when there's a misalignment of values in a person or a misalignment of values in a system, we get conflict. And so there is, the more our systems mirror the values of the people who use them, the greater the flow of economic vitality through the person and through the system. And so, the system that I think about is at the micro level, but I'm curious about other panelists. I'll yield the time. I could go on, but I want to yield to Molly or Dr. Lewis or Adair.
I just want to say real quick, because whoever wrote the question, right, they were saying as an ally, like how do I find this out? I just want to say, like, myself as an ally as well, like, asking is definitely headed in the right direction rather than just assuming what is best for the community, right? And so one of the things just that we've been doing at Accenture is we'll go around and we have human-centered design activities, just like similar to what Adair was talking about, where we try and find out sort of what the challenges are and then work with the community to do the solutioning as well through human-centered design processes. And I think it's really helpful in helping identify, potential systemic investments and different priorities as well. So I just want to sort of reflect that we've been doing a similar process, and I think you're on the right track. But I want to sort of turn it over to Dr. Lewis and Adair to maybe talk about some of the priorities that you guys have seen.
So this is a big question, I feel like, for me in my work. And I'm trying to process, where does one begin? So I think of like change in like these 3 buckets, maybe. So there's like short-term tangible wins. I think there's long-term goals that require like multiple systems to work and build together. And I think what I call radical imaginings, there are these things that I think are of context that we don't have, that don't exist yet, but I think we should imagine as possible. And within those buckets, there's like policy, practice, and culture. I think Theresa was talking about culture, and I really love this idea of the misalignment of values. In many ways, policy and practice really means nothing in reality if we can't change our cultural way of being. So I'm asked to speak a great deal. I've done some talks recently for like Target and Wells Fargo, and many of those talks are centered around questions of like race, racism, identity, and they're really trying to process the politics of both allyship and questioning. We could come up with amazing policy ideas. They can trickle down into practices, but actual people have to implement them. Okay? And those actual people have values. And those actual people have ingrained and been acculturated into a process or politics of white supremacy that makes how they impart that work harmful to people. So what I struggle with in the work that I do is, because I work in the policy and practice space, and I help people, whether it's develop policy, implement policy and practice, but it often falls apart at the human interaction. So I guess, I just want to say that first, and then to say, in the spaces I'm moving right now, I'm working with a contract and juvenile justice, juvenile probation department. And we're talking about everything from, calendaring issues to the school to prison pipeline. to help to ensure that our youth are getting access to diversion programs or alternative ways of supporting their growth versus getting placed into the system. Entries into the system are huge. I'm working on a child protection project. There are so many disproportionate issues in the area of child protection as it relates to the Black family, as it relates to what's happening to children within the child protection system, Black children and Native children in particular. I'm working on a bail reform project right now. Let's just be honest, risk assessment tools are very biased. And I think we need to rethink deeply how those tools are placing more Black and brown faces in jails. I'm working on a project in the shelters where we're trying to reimagine the self-pay policy right now. If you want to stabilize families and you ask them to pay to stay, that is the opposite of what you're asking them. That's a policy in Hennepin County. That's winnable and that's tangible. I mean, I can keep doing this, but it ranges, right? I think there are things that are winnable and easy. We have the fastest eviction process in the country. You can get evicted in 2 weeks. It can take up to 30 days for Hennepin County Emergency Assistance to tell you if they're going to help you or not. That's a policy change. I don't know, pick it. There are so many things that I think are winnable and tangible, but I also find that we work in silos. I will work with someone from the city and the county. The county doesn't know what the city does. The city doesn't know what the county does. How could you expect community to understand any of this if you can't explain, even in your own position, like what you do or who you report to or how that influences what the county does? It's disheartening, to say the least, in much of the work that I do. Because we also put the onus on community and we also point the finger at community. We pull out data and statistics and we blame them for the context in which they're in, but we can't even explain, our own hierarchies.
Our colleague Theresa may be logging off here, and we are at time, and she just put her contact information. But we do want to thank you. And I think one of the things that, as you move and think about your work, as we've been talking a lot about kind of at the systemic level, but that's truly the work that's left on the table. That in this next iteration, in this process, that we can't have incremental, incremental change is not going to get us there. It's the leaps, and it's the kind of catalytic and transformative investments in this work. It's policy, but it's also lining the fiscal and regulatory mechanisms with policy. And it's the people that sit and make the policy that are allowed us to, that have proximity to community, that allow us to be able to transform and move this work forward. Unfortunately, in this region, you can pick your disparity and work on it. So just start, because we are certainly categorically have disenfranchised quite a few people across the entire spectrum. I do think that the education and economic power is going to be two of the most catalytic things to move us forward for Black people, and centering that. So we thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to our panelists again. This was amazing. Thank you to everyone attending. These things always feel like there's never enough time. So thank you for staying with us a few minutes over. And please head to the main stage. We're at noon. There'll be a keynote featuring Patrice Kunesh. So I really hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.
Everyone.